I've given you 2 top 10 scariest horror films of all time, but we're not done yet. It's time to close it off and go for part 3. Let's do this. What is up, guys? I had so much fun doing the last 2 scary horror countdowns, and I tell you, those videos are doing very, very well. So a huge thank you to you guys that have jumped in there, watched those videos. The first one's almost at 20,000 views now, which is insane to me. So I guess you guys like these countdowns, but this one is going to be a really fun one. You're going to see some sequels in this list. And I'm definitely going to throw in a surprise or 2 in here too. Maybe one that you haven't seen or might have passed you by. So, and I like how interactive you guys are in the comments too. And a lot of times I see movies that I haven't seen yet in the comments. So thank you for that. I love my community. I love the Drumdums community. You guys, you're passionate. You're passionate about horror. I love that. Also, this video will be dedicated to one of my newer patrons, Reese Perkins. If you are of a certain tier, then you can have a video dedicated to you in your honor. So Reese, this one's for you. But real quick, as I always do, I'm looking at my list right now. I need to make a quick change, so just give me a second. Okay, so anyway, I got 3 honorable mentions here. Let's go ahead and kick it off. First honorable mention is gonna be Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. You know, Part 2 catches a lot of flack, but you know what? I think it has the scariest version of Freddy. I think it even tops the first one in terms of the character being really scary, being really serious. And it has one of my all-time favorite opening sequences in horror history, the school bus scene. I mean, talk about a really scary scene, just petrifying. When you're on this school bus and it starts off nice, daylight and everything, but then all of a sudden it goes into this freaking like desert terrain. And we all have that fear of being in a vehicle where we don't have control, like say a taxi or something like that. Like I've heard stories about this where the vehicle doesn't go the intended direction and then you have no control of the situation. And then add Freddy Krueger to that. And then you're on this freaking rock out in this like hellish looking abyss. That's how effective that opening scene was. And it really set the table for the movie, actually. And I think there's a lot of really scary scenes in Part 2, especially when Freddy comes out of Jesse's body. The first time I saw that, I about crapped my pants. I'm gonna tell you that right now. Okay, second honorable mention, Tourist Trap. I just saw Tourist Trap for the first time quite a few months ago, reviewed it. But what shocks me is the movie is PG. And this is probably one of the very few, if not only, PG slashers out there. This isn't your normal slasher. You know, you got this guy who has this kind of obsession with dolls, like mannequins. And I would say this has probably the creepiest mannequins I've ever seen in a horror movie. Even topping Maniac. Now, Maniac is a completely different plot. And you know what? I didn't even add Maniac to this list, but Maniac is scary. But I think Maniac's more disturbing than scary. And a lot of you guys have asked me to do a top 10 disturbing horror list, so I think I'll save Maniac for that. But Tourist Trap is scary. It's just a really scary movie, especially when these characters, they get captured by our main antagonist. And really, it's the mannequins. The mannequins really freak me out in this movie. I just like the creepy feel. It's one of those Texas horror movies, and I think those Texas horror movies, horror directors, they have their own little flavor to them. You know, think like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that type stuff. So Tourist Trap, highly recommend. Okay, last honorable mention, I'm gonna go with Psycho 2. And Psycho 2 definitely did not let you off the hook in terms of scares. And I like that just, you know, this is Norman Bates coming out of jail after 22 years. And what are the repercussions of that? To me, that alone is kind of scary because this was a guy that was very psychotic and unhinged in the first movie. So 22 years later, how's he going to react? And this movie explores those possibilities. But Tom Holland really knew how to dish out the scares in this movie. There's quite a few scenes, especially with the character Norman himself. Anthony Perkins, I think, this might be his best performance as the character. But that scene where he's like talking to his mother and you got Meg Tilly trying to like tell him that, hey, this whole thing, it's been a hoax. But he's far too gone at this point. And so like he like switches the phone over to the other side. And just that sequence right there, super scary. and there's not an ounce of blood in the scene whatsoever. There's plenty of blood in this movie, don't get me wrong though. I mean, the kill scene with the knife to the mouth, which was in my top 25 kill scenes, that scene is really scary. And plus it takes place in like the basement, and it's not just your normal basement, it's like one of those like unfinished basements with the dirt and everything, and you know, you got this pile of cold rocks over her dead body after he kills her. Just really creepy stuff. Okay, top 10, here we go. Number 10, Friday the 13th, part 4. I told you there'd be some sequels in here. Part 4 is a Scary Friday movie, and I think it's the last really Scary Friday movie, but they went out with a bang. I'm not gonna lie, I was afraid to death of Jason Voorhees in parts 2, 3, and 4. But 4, I think, topped them all, especially in the end when you have Tommy Jarvis coming downstairs, shaving his head. That creeped me out as a little kid. And then him taking Jason's machete and whacking him right over the side of the head. I'd never seen practical effects like this in my life, and I was scared to death when I saw that scene unfold. It was just chaotic, and it doesn't let up. You know, it's one of those scenes, there's a lot going on, you know, with Trish and, you know, Tommy and Jason. Ted White's performance is amazing in the scene. Really, that last act of Friday Part 4 is balls to the wall in the scare factor. Number 9, The Howling. I think when you compare The Howling to American Werewolf in London, I think The Howling is the scarier movie. And both movies are very scary, but The Howling, I think the effects themselves top American Werewolf in London. I think Rob Bottin's work is just creepier looking. It's just my personal opinion. Some of you might prefer Rick Baker's work. And Rick Baker's work is amazing, but I'm talking about in terms of being scary. Rick Baker's work is extremely talented and realistic. Rob Bottin's work is terrifying. That's what you get with The Howling. And every time a character turned into a werewolf in that movie, I wanted to put the covers over my head because I couldn't take it. It's just a really creepy movie. And even like the sex scene when the girl, she's like turning into a werewolf, or he's turning into a werewolf while they're having sex. And it's a creepy scene. Creepy and seductive, but creepy. Was I turned on by that scene? Yes, I was. Number 8, Sleepaway Camp. Now, this is a movie that you can laugh at. You can definitely laugh at Sleepaway Camp, but nobody can be prepared for what happened in the ending of the movie, and I think it's a shock factor, but it's also scary. It's a creepy, creepy scene because... Spoiler warning here, okay? Because if you haven't seen Sleepaway Camp, it is the biggest gift of a twist ending in horror history in my mind. So I don't want you to hear this if you haven't seen the ending of Sleepaway Camp, okay? So there's your warning. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When it's revealed that Angela is a man, it's not the fact that she's a man that's so surprising. The fact is the way it's unveiled on screen. And just the sound of like that... isn't that creepy just hearing that? That sounds stupid. It's just a really disturbing scene. And I freak out every time I watch it. I've seen that ending so many times, and every time I see it, it still gets me. It still gets me every time. It's unsettling as hell. And I think part of that too is because Angela looks like such an innocent person. You know, Felissa Rose was like 12, 13 at the time. And so to see her turn into this guy, which we could go into that backstory all day about that guy's never showed his face since. Check out my Sleepaway Camp Revisited review. I go into that whole thing. It's interesting as hell. Number 7, The Conjuring, a more modern movie. And I think in terms of like possession movies, this was probably the most effective since The Exorcist in terms of what it was going for. You know, it had a similar type of vibe that The Exorcist did. You know, seeing one of the characters turn into like a full-on demon at the end of the movie and it being very effective. It was really scary. And one thing that makes The Conjuring so great too is everybody loves a good haunted house story. And this house, you know, has a history and it's based on a true story. But James Wan is a great director. Like, it's hard these days to come up with something interesting and creative and scary. We've seen all the tricks before, but James Wan somehow is always able to stay ahead of the curve. And there's quite a few scenes in this movie that do get you. Like that scene, really scary. The child that her body gets pulled by the ghost or the entity in the bed. That's a scene that's been done a few times since. I think even by James Wan again, if I'm being honest. But The Conjuring, it's a good movie too, and when you can add something really scary to an already good movie, then that just makes it even better. Number 6, another John Carpenter movie, Prince of Darkness. This might be the most unsettling John Carpenter movie out there. It's hard to say if it's the scariest. This is the movie that I feel like I need a bath after watching it. Like I feel unsafe. I feel like something has taken over me. And it's cool when we have movies that do that, because this movie deals with, Satan and what's referred to as the anti-god. There's just a lot of really demonic aspects of this movie. With the green ooze too, let's present this element that is otherworldly, that we're not sure what it is, and anything can happen. That's what Prince of Darkness is. It has that feeling of, I don't know what's around the corner. And it doesn't hurt that John Carpenter's score is so effective. And this is one of those last acts too that really just goes for broke. And you want to call your mama after. You definitely want to call your mother after watching this movie. Okay, number 5 is The Evil. This is a movie that a lot of you might not have seen. It's a movie that one of my patrons at the time, Ted Harrington, he requested me to review, and it was such a nice surprise because this was a scary movie. It was 1978, and maybe because of The Exorcist, this movie got swallowed up, even though The Exorcist came out like 5 years earlier. But it's just not a movie that I had ever heard of or nobody ever talked about. But there's some really creepy stuff in this movie. It's about this couple. They buy this haunted house to try to turn it into like a recovery center for drug addicts. But they buy the wrong house because it has like the gateway to hell in it. And you don't want to buy a house that has the gateway to hell. So make sure you ask your realtor if the house that she's showing you has the gateway to hell in it, because they have to technically answer you. But there's a lot of creepy stuff in this movie too. I like that this is a movie filmed in 1978, so everything has to be practical. And the one scene that really got me is when the one actress, her clothes are literally like ripped off and her body is just sliding all over the place. Think kind of like Poltergeist, but much more terrifying. There's a lot of that type stuff in this movie. There's hangings, there's all kinds of crazy stuff. But another thing is they can't leave the house. At one point in the movie, they're locked in the house. And so they have to face this nightmare head on. And, not a lot of them are going to come out alive. Number 4, Ridley Scott's Alien. I saw a lot of people mentioning these in the last 2 countdowns. And sure, Alien definitely belongs on any scary horror list. I think I didn't put it on the previous 2 because it's always a go-to. Like everybody always mentions Alien when they talk about top 10 horror movies. And Alien it's very effective, but I like to try to throw curveballs in these lists from time to time. So I figured I'd save Alien for this list. And of course, the Xenomorph I think is probably, honestly, the most genius alien creature ever created. But it's really scary too, especially when you see like the goo that like drips from his mouth and all that stuff, and just the biology of the creature. How he starts off as this parasite, and then the parasite goes into the host, and then the xenomorph comes out of the host. The scene in the middle of the movie where the host comes out of John Hurt. Wow. Can you imagine audiences in 1979 sitting in the theater, not knowing what's to come and seeing that scene unfold? Hell, even the actors on set, those reactions are real reactions. That's how crazy that scene was. And when you're doing a scene like that, you definitely don't want to tell the actors how they're going to film it. I'm sure they read the script, but I guarantee you they were thinking, how in the hell are they going to film this thing? But also, like in the very end, when you got the countdown and the mother and Sigourney Weaver, she's getting undressed, getting into her spacesuit, and behind her, the xenomorph, we don't see him. He's like camouflaged with the ship, and then all of a sudden that hand like pops out. That still gets me every time. Number 3, Let the Right One In. This is probably the scariest vampire movie I've ever seen. There's no joking about it. It's not a tongue-in-cheek type vampire movie, as a lot of vampire movies are. It drives it home seriously all the way through for the full runtime. It answers that question of what if a vampire enters the house without permission, and that scene will really, really make you feel uncomfortable. But really just the overall vibe, the overall tone of this movie it feels uneasy, and there's just this sense of dread throughout. You know, you feel like this movie's not going to end very well at all. This is a character that's over 100 years old that's trapped in a child's body, and so it's sad, really. That's really what let the right one in. It's just a tragic story about this child, and her life is just pretty much consumed with death. She has to constantly kill people to stay alive. She falls in love with this little boy, you know. If she doesn't love him, she cares about him like a sister. I don't know, but it's like a beautiful relationship within this tragedy of a story. And I think the pool scene at the end will definitely knock your socks off in terms of scares. It's just very unexpected. I think it was filmed beautifully. And I'm talking about the original version too, by the way, not the remake. The remake's great, but the original, man, probably one of the best vampire movies ever made. Number 2, one of my all-time favorite movies, The Descent. And I've had The Descent on so many of my countdowns. And every time I always talk about, you know, the relationship between the girls, Sarah and Juno and all that stuff. And I rarely talk about the creatures, because the creatures really aren't needed for this movie. This movie is just about paranoia. Kind of like The Thing is. You could compare this movie to The Thing in a lot of ways. But on a scary list, you kind of have to mention those creatures because, man, I tell you, it's balls to the wall once they get down into that cave. Like, this is the middle of the movie. There's all this turmoil going on with the girls. And then all of a sudden, like that scene where they're just standing there, and then boom, the creature just appears from behind them, and it just gets insane. And they have to kill the creatures. And they don't hold back in terms of the blood in this movie either. Like Neil Marshall, he really went for broke just to make it feel as visceral as possible. You know, I think if you add the element of emotion to a scary movie, it just makes it that much more effective. Think back to The Exorcist. One reason The Exorcist works so well is because of the emotion in the movie. The mother having to deal with her child being a demon. Same thing here. You know, this tragedy that Sarah went through in her life, and then coming to this cave, and really it takes this nightmare for her to find redemption, for her to find a new purpose in life, you know. And sometimes that happens, you know. Sometimes we have tragic circumstances that ultimately shape us as human beings. And that's really what The Descent is about. Those creatures are scary as hell, though. And number 1, The Exorcist, Part 3. The Exorcist franchise has topped 2 of these 3 countdowns. Exorcist 3 is a beautifully made film by the actual writer of the first movie and this movie, William Peter Blatty. I like that he was able to make the movie that he wanted to make, even though studio meddling caused 2 different versions to happen in this movie. But man, the performance by Brad Dourif in this, like, that's an actor. Like, that's crazy good, and he's so good that he's scary, you know. There's a few scenes in there where it's just him and another character, George C. Scott, and you know, it's one thing to act out your lines, but to come off as a demon, to come off as scary. Brad Dourif did it. And in both versions, there's how much Brad Dourif you're going to get is a different story. Jason Miller is in more of the theatrical cut, but you still get some Brad Dourif in there. It's still very effective, though. But the greatest jump scene in probably horror history, you got the camera, you get the full view of the hospital hallway, and it's just nice and quiet, and you're like waiting for something to happen, and then all of a sudden, boom, the Gemini killer just comes straight after her. And you know, the music sells that scene too. But man, just a beautifully crafted jump scare, and it's one that directors have tried a million times to recapture, and it's almost impossible. It's just such a very effective, well done scene, and more importantly, extremely scary, terrifying. But the last act too, with the one priest, and his body pretty much just gets mutilated. It's just really unsettling stuff. But The Exorcist 3, it's an example of a wonderfully made film. I mean, this is A-level, top-notch filmmaking, and these scares are still very effective. They do not hold back whatsoever. I mean, it's The Exorcist, you know, and I think that it almost matches the first movie in terms of intensity. It's just a very different story. And there are people that say they prefer Exorcist 3 over the first movie. It's one of those movies that has really gained a strong cult following. And don't we just love when movies do that? Like, I love when movies find their audience that aren't as successful when they first come out. Because I don't believe Exorcist 3 was that successful when it first came out. But man, the horror community loves this movie and they constantly keep talking about it. Hell, Joe Bob Briggs just did an episode on the drive-in for Exorcist 3. So definitely check that episode out if you haven't. But Exorcist 3 definitely belongs #1 on this list. We did it, guys. 3 top 10s scariest horror films ever made. What did I miss out on? What did I leave out? Let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day, and on Fridays we do Free For All Fridays. Follow me at Drumdums on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and Drumdum out.